Fans of console RPGs were waiting patiently in early 1997 for Final Fantasy VII. The PlayStation offered a variety of initial RPGs to help pacify enthusiasts. Among these games was Vandal Hearts, released by Konami in North America on March 27, 1997. However, the game was quite a bit different from many of the other RPGs available on the system at that time, such as Beyond the Beyond. There is also a clear contrast between Vandal Hearts and Suikoden, which was also published and released by Konami. Unlike those two games, Vandal Hearts had a distinctive strategy-based RPG feel, which borrowed influences from games like Tactics Ogre and Fire Emblem. Those games, like Vandal Hearts, utilize a grid-based map for combat, where movement and positioning is a key element of the game. Those who discovered Vandal Hearts near when it came out were in for a treat, as the relatively unique battle system and dark brooding story brought hours of gameplay to those who picked it up. Also, Vandal Hearts offered a huge variety of characters, the number of which grows as you progress through the game. After playing the game for just 5 minutes, it's easy to see how story-driven Vandal Hearts is. 15 years before the beginning of the game, a group of rebels began to resist the powerful Holy Asha Empire. Among them was Eris the Sage, a popular figure that united various anti-imperial factions against the government. These factions formed the Liberation Army, overthrew the Empire, and established a republic. The player begins the game as Ash Lambert, leader of the 3rd Platoon of the Ishtarian Security Forces. He is joined by his friends Clinton Diego in opposing corruption at the highest levels of government. Indeed, Ash and his friends suspect a conspiracy at the very highest levels of the Republic. Because they reveal their skepticism, Ash and his friends come within the crosshairs of the Ishtarian government, who begin to question their loyalties and their purpose. Betrayal, murder, tyranny, and justice are all important themes that this game explores. The combat and gameplay are probably the most important and defining characteristics of Vandal Hearts. Battles take place on grid-based maps, each with its own unique look. Depending on the scenario, maps are filled with bridges, buildings, hills, and water, and they all have varying elevations for different parts of the map. One of the best parts of Vandal Hearts is using the maps to your advantage by positioning your characters in the right place for each moment. In battles, you execute a character turn in which your own units each get a chance to move and perform an action. Then, the enemy gets a turn and enemy units have the chance to do the same. The turns then rotate until you complete the objective or are defeated. Although some of the battles can take a long time, character turns are swift enough so that it doesn't really seem like it. The combat was just constructed very well in Vandal Hearts, and it really is one of the most enjoyable aspects of the game. One great thing about the combat is that it revolves around unique battle objectives. Unlike some other strategy games of this type where the goal is simply to kill all enemies on a given map, Vandal Hearts often provides alternate objectives that force the player to make more battle-specific choices. Another interesting facet of combat is that it is bloody. In fact, that's the understatement of the century. When you defeat enemies in this game, blood spurts all over the place. It's a bit over the top, and it's almost comical how extreme it is. I can definitely remember being surprised about this the first time I played the game. That said, I ended up liking the choice because it adds to the dark theme, and almost no other RPG has ever done something like this. Whatever one thinks about these blood geysers, it certainly became a distinct part of the Vandal Hearts franchise. While the background graphics in Vandal Hearts are 3D rendered, the characters and enemies themselves are sprites. The backgrounds aren't the best example of 3D rendering of PlayStation content, but at the time they were pretty good, and the spinning camera during combat helps the player get a grasp for the feel. For its time, the game also offered some of the best sprite animations that had ever been seen to that point, including swirling swords, slicing weapons, spellcasting motions, and flying arrows. This may seem like a mundane characteristic, but these animations undoubtedly provided a more realistic feel that the game is notorious for. For its time, the graphics of Vandal Hearts look pretty good, though they're not spectacular. This was in an age before many of the RPGs on the PlayStation had gone to full 3D, but I actually think Vandal Hearts holds up better than some of its 3D counterparts. The soundtrack of Vandal Hearts is quite distinct, and it uses a lot of horns and drums unlike other games. I can't say I thought it was as memorable as Konami's other game from that year, Suikoden, but it still was very good and quite unique for an RPG. Out of all the qualities that make Vandal Hearts worth playing, the storyline should be at the top of the list. The serious nature of the plot makes it an original offering in a world where most RPGs opted for a more optimistic feel. Well, this game is hardly that. Instead, it's actually quite unrelenting, and calling it dark is no exaggeration. There are parts in the game where the slaughter is almost over the top and so malevolent that it stands out immediately. Even though Vandal Hearts mostly flew under the radar and was soon overshadowed by giants like Final Fantasy VII and Chrono Cross, it really was one of the best RPGs in the early years of the PlayStation, and definitely deserves to be played today. In fact, I consider the game to be one of the hidden gems on the system. It won't blow anyone away completely, but those that love Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy Tactics are almost guaranteed to love Vandal Hearts. In the early days of the Sony PlayStation, many RPG fans eagerly awaited the arrival of Final Fantasy VII. In the months before its release, some prepared early by buying a PlayStation, along with any other game that would feed their RPG appetite. Among these titles were Beyond the Beyond and Suikoden, both of which aspired to tap into a niche market of enthusiasts. Separating itself from these titles was Vandal Hearts, an isometric strategy RPG released at the end of 1996. Many fell in love with the game for its dark story, its distinct spurts of blood, and its tactical-oriented gameplay. In the 3 years that passed afterwards, Squaresoft created its own counterpart, Final Fantasy Tactics, that was met with much more critical acclaim than Vandal Hearts ever enjoyed. Konami responded by releasing the sequel to the game, Vandal Hearts 2, in North America in late 1999. I remember playing this game back then because I started it soon after I finished Final Fantasy VIII, one of the hottest games on the PlayStation at the time. The different feel of Vandal Hearts 2 relative to FF8 certainly made it stick out in my mind back then, and made me appreciate Konami's drive to innovate. The game's story centers upon Joshua, a young man caught up in a devastating civil war in the country of Natra. Like the first Vandal Hearts, the main protagonist's close childhood companions also play a major role in the development of the plot. The storyline sequences stand out for their use of character animations, many of which were clearly designed for specific scenes in the game. As in the first title, the shifting camera also adds drama and surprise to the story's development, which was also a nice touch. Vandal Hearts 2 also features a branching plot of sorts, where player-driven dialogue choices and other decisions lead to different outcomes. The system is epitomized by the existence of 4 completely different endings, which certainly adds an element of replayability to the game. In most ways, combat in Vandal Hearts 2 plays out in almost the same way as the first. Battles take place on a grid-based map, where terrain and distance play a big role in gaining the upper hand against the enemy and defending your own units. The one major area where Vandal Hearts 2 sets itself apart from almost any other tactical RPG was in its dual-turn system. In most games of this kind, each battle is divided into player and computer turns, where one unit moves and performs an action before the next character gets a chance to do the same. In Vandal Hearts 2 though, both the player and the computer move a single unit at the same time. I have to give Konami a lot of credit for coming up with a bold and unique gameplay mechanic such as this. Unfortunately though, I don't really think it works for this type of game. This is because tactical RPGs function best by allowing the player to react to specific circumstances on the field. With the dual movement system, it makes combat choices feel too unpredictable and doesn't yield as much satisfaction or accomplishment as making the right choices. Even so, I appreciate the effort to make the battles in Vandal Hearts 2 stand out from other tactical RPGs, and I bet others like the dual movement system better than I do. Vandal Hearts 2 features the return of head musical composer Hiroshi Tamawari, who produced a distinctive score for the original title. His unmistakable style, with its emphasis on horns, percussion, and harps, is just as apparent in this one. It's perfect for the game's medieval style, and really sets it apart from the more melodic-oriented RPG composers like Nobuo Uematsu. With 76 songs in total, it's one of the biggest RPG soundtracks on the entire system, and its variety makes the score hold up better than most games on the PlayStation. In the end, Vandal Hearts 2 is a great tactical RPG that you shouldn't miss, especially if you liked the first Vandal Hearts game. I can't say it's quite as good as the original, I just didn't fall in love with the characters and story to the same extent. However, it's certainly respectable and contains all the elements that made the first one great. A dark and serious story, interesting characters, and strategic gameplay that tests the player's ability to think on the fly. If you like the Fire Emblem games, Final Fantasy Tactics, or Tactics Xygor, you can't miss out on Vandal Hearts 2. It's in the same caliber. Both Vandal Hearts and its follow-up, Vandal Hearts 2, were two of the best tactical RPGs on the Sony PlayStation. Memorable for their dark storylines, great music, and blood-spurting combat, the Vandal Hearts games really made an impression on RPG fans that played them at the time. After Vandal Hearts 2 was released in 1999, however, the franchise entered into what seemed to be an endless slumber. Ultimately, the Vandal Hearts titles were a bit overshadowed by Konami's other RPG series, Suikoden. The two franchises shared some similarities, but the latter was much more of a traditional RPG series. Over a decade after Vandal Hearts 2, Konami published Vandal Hearts: The Flames of Judgment on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. Many fans were eager to give it a try, having waited so long since the last entry in the series. What they discovered, however, was a bit different from what they had been accustomed to. As far as the story goes, you take control of the main protagonist, Tobias, an orphan who's caught up in a devastating war between the kingdoms of Urdu and Balustrade. A moment of divine intervention intends to end the war, but one ambitious general refuses to accept peace. It is in these circumstances that Tobias and his friends are unexpectedly brought into the struggle, and tragedy strikes close to home. A lot of the story unfolds in the game's typical graphical style on a grid-based field, but other storyline moments unfold in animated sequences. On the surface, I like the idea of doing this, as these scenes added a lot of context to the themes at the heart of the game. However, I really think the exaggerated animation style doesn't mesh well with the dark moments and bloodshed. The game presents the actors as cartoon characters in a gloomy world of death and destruction, and some of the events that transpire in the game make this all the more apparent. There are moments that make it appear like Daffy Duck is slicing someone open. It's just weird and incongruent with the otherwise dark feel. If you're familiar with the other Vandal Hearts games, you'll pick up the combat gameplay really fast. It's a grid-oriented tactical RPG wherein each character can move one time and perform one action per turn. Battles have set victory objectives that must be accomplished in order to proceed in the game. Most of them involve killing all enemies on the battlefield, but there are other conditions as well. Characters can wield 2 weapons each, and you can mix range and melee weapons together on the same character. Each character can also use magic, which is learned by equipping spellbook items. At about 12 to 15 hours, the game is relatively short for a tactical RPG. Some of the objectives do provide a challenge, but if you know how the game works, you can pretty much plow through this one. Like most games of this type, your success is dependent on the extent to which you can properly customize your characters. So if you're good at innovating and adjusting, this will definitely come easy for you. I think the game overall is a bit less difficult than the first 2 Vandal Hearts games. When it comes down to it, I just don't think the third entry in the Vandal Hearts franchise holds up to the caliber of the others. The story has some similar themes, but the characters just aren't as lovable. And I think the comical, graphical, and animation style really detracts from the game's intended dark feel. Perhaps the biggest reason for this is that the game was made by a completely different development team than that which created the first 2 games, and that fact really shows. I don't think that Vandal Hearts: Flames of Judgment was much of a success, and if you're a retro RPG fan like me, it's best to stick to the first 2 games. They provide a much more fun experience. Unfortunately, with the release of Vandal Hearts: Flames of Judgment, the Vandal Hearts franchise as a whole seemed to meet its end. Konami's other RPG series, Suikoden, seemed to overshadow the franchise and gains greater respect from old-school fans of the genre today. To me, the first Vandal Hearts game is not only the best in the series, but also the most representative of the franchise, and the best one to recommend to new players. The tactical gameplay, dark story, and distinctive blood spurts work together to produce a very fun game that still holds up pretty well. The second is very much like the first, and offers the same style of gameplay. The third game, unfortunately, was too big of a departure for me. I'm sure there are some that still like it, but I just never got into it. Instead, checking it out only served to remind me why I almost totally stopped playing console games around 2006. By that point, they just didn't make RPGs like they used to. Unfortunately, none of the Vandal Hearts games are available via Steam. However, you can still find used copies on eBay today, and the price doesn't seem quite as outrageous compared to some of the other RPGs on the system. Down in the comments, I want to hear from you. If you played the Vandal Hearts games, what in your mind sticks out about them the most? If you haven't played them, what makes you interested in giving them a try? If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel and click the bell below to be alerted upon the addition of new ones. Also, please join my Discord community linked in the description, and consider supporting my channel via YouTube's Join feature to receive member exclusives, such as advanced videos and complete video transcripts.